Salisbury and the surrounding area is an ancient land filled with rich history and has helped modern archaeologists uncover some of the most important discoveries which have served as a key to understanding our heritage and ancestry through the ages. Today, we will turn back the pages thousands of years to the birth of humanity in England and what existed long before the first stone of Salisbury was ever laid. Join me as we uncover the origins of Salisbury. The earliest human occupation around Salisbury can be dated back to around 420 to 450,000 years ago. In 1860, nearly 100 flint hand axes were found during a dig for clay in order to make bricks. The sheer amount of hand axes in such close proximity could hint towards a permanent, or at least semi-permanent, settlement here, back when Great Britain looked very different and there was no English Channel. Shortly after, hundreds more flint hand axes around the same period were found during a construction project. These hand axes were reported in 1964 by Dr. Humphrey Blackmore, curator of Salisbury Museum. Meanwhile, over in Dorset, along the coincidentally named River Axe Valley, more hand axes were unearthed in a gravel pit during the construction of a new railway. However, unlike the flint examples found in neighbouring Wiltshire, these axes were made of chert stone and were dated to between 250 and 280,000 years ago. In Dunbridge, Hampshire, a plethora of hand axes were found at a similar gravel pit. The first ones were unearthed in the early 1900s and are continuing to be unearthed even to today. Currently, there have been over 1,000 axe heads discovered. These flint axe heads also date between the 250 to 280,000 year old margin. A miraculous and somewhat magical discovery occurred during the construction work for a road in Harnham in 2003, where more flint axe heads were found. However, alongside this discovery, amongst the various animal bones, were tiny pieces of wood charcoal. The carbon dating of these flakes placed the charcoal, and most likely the axes as well, to be about 250,000 years old. This could be the earliest evidence of fire in Britain, and indeed possibly in Europe. A variety of animal bones were discovered in Fisherton in the 19th century. These remains gave a key insight into the fauna that were roaming around the British countryside 59,000 years ago. Beasts such as auroch, which were wild oxen, mammoths, bison, rhinoceros, hyena, and even lions. These would have either been the Paleolithic people's food or dangers during their daily life. It is important to note that, during this time period, farming still hasn't been introduced to Britain, meaning that the indigenous population were living on a strictly hunter-gatherer diet of fish, meat, berries, seeds, and foraged fruit and vegetables. This posed a problem for the local wildlife. Over the next 45,000 years, as the hominid population continued to adapt in Britain's climate, and their population got bigger and bigger, most large species of animal were hunted to extinction, including the mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and the giant sloth. It should also be said that modern humans like you and I, or Homo sapiens sapiens, hadn't even arrived on the scene in Britain yet. They arrived much later, around 40,000 years ago. Between 500,000 and 40,000 years ago, there were multiple variations of hominids roaming around the British landscape before Homo sapiens, such as Homo antecessor, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo neanderthalensis, or as we know them today, Neanderthals. Indeed, some of these species would have shared a timeline with each other on the British Isles, and although hard evidence for this is scarce, if not non-existent, we can assume that the arrival of modern Homo sapiens sapiens spelled doom for these more ancient hominids. Over time they failed to compete with the faster, more intelligent settler. and I'll be making a video discussing how sustainable and how in tune with nature hunter-gatherer man truly was. We move on to the Mesolithic age, and we find one of the earliest examples of post holes discovered during a survey for a housing development project in Downton during the 1950s. These post holes, along with the heaps of flint shards found scattered around them, confirm a permanent settlement and, most likely, a flint working station, where Mesolithic people would sit and work the stone in a process called flint knapping. These discoveries date to around 6000 BC, which would have been an interesting time to be alive, as this part of the world was beginning to heat up again after the last ice age, and a vast array of flora and fauna had returned to the British landscape. This meant that Mesolithic man required various different tools to hunt and process the animals available. As we approach the early Neolithic period by around 4000 BC, we begin to see some of the most beautiful examples of craftsmanship, such as this incredible jade axe head. Found in the 19th century, we do not know exactly where it was found, but it was believed to be excavated from a barrow near Stonehenge. From what we understand, this jade comes from an ancient quarry in the Italian Alps, and would have had to travel a very long way to reach its new home here on the Salisbury Plain. In recent years, we are beginning to find more and more evidence that Neolithic people were capable of travelling enormous distances, and our understanding of their trade networks are being rewritten every decade. Flint mines found in Eastern Down proved that Neolithic people were quarrying through the rock in search for workable flint on an industrial level here on the Salisbury Plain over 5,500 years ago, with the mines showing similar characteristics as the famous Grimes Graves mines in Norfolk. These miners were using rudimentary tools such as bones and deer antlers, showing that they tried using everything that the animals of which they hunted could offer. Evidence supports that these mines were in use for over 2,000 years. The arrival of the Neolithic period also brought great change to the landscape of England with the agricultural-industrial revolution. The revolution of Neolithic agriculture saw the forests of England being largely cut down over time, making room for basic farmlands which would have originally taken up a lot of space yet yielding lackluster results. Over the centuries that followed, however, the agricultural industry gradually became more and more efficient, eventually allowing people to put down the hunting bow and rely largely on a more domesticated lifestyle of tilling the fields, harvesting the crop, and fishing the rivers. For the first time since man's initial steps into the wilds of England, these nomad hunter-gatherers were able, for a moment at least, to put their feet up and relax amongst their working day. It was due to this that we now see the fruits of their labour in all their glory. Introducing the Age of Religion. Now that farms had become the main source of food in England, due to being a sustainable and reliable source of nutrients, humans found themselves staying in one area more often, so began building more permanent homes which would protect them from all seasons, and hence began digging deeper into the earth to lay the grounds for foundations, which are the post holes that we uncover today. Along with this, we now see larger, more robust fireplaces, called hearths, placed in the centres of these homes. Over time, as word began to spread where the best soils were for farming, more people would gather to settle in more favourable areas, Salisbury Plain being a particularly sought-after area. As more people settled effectively next door to each other, communities began to sprout. Inevitably, these communities required a political centre to dish out the jobs required for the day, to discuss news and potential threats, and everything else that was vital for sustaining a community of people living together. So what better than a circular hub where all the people could gather together? Enter the invention of the henge. Now I shan't go into too much detail about henges, as I have a video dedicated to them, as well as other Neolithic and Bronze Age architecture, so instead I will leave that video in the description below. But we now see henge sites crop up all over Britain, the most notable one being of course Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, with multiple other henges dotting the nearby landscape, some made of wood and some made of stone. And we also see some simply consisting of circular earthen banks with no evidence for any wooden or stone structure like that of Robin Hood's Ball just north of Stonehenge. Nevertheless, this all suggested that the area around Salisbury was of significant importance to the Neolithic people. It is not completely clear what the original intended use of these henge sites were, with some argument being that they were originally built to carry out religious practices, some believing that they were used as calendars, and others believing that their intended use may have been that they served as community hubs, to show off the strength and will of the local community, raising them above their neighbours in importance. Personally, from my own studies, I believe the truth is to be the latter. It is more likely that these henge sites were originally used as a cultural hub, as they were monolithic construction projects for their day, requiring hundreds of able-bodied individuals to carry out back-breaking work over centuries. The very ability to create these giant monuments would require a community working together with time to spend on such a lengthy process, not to mention having a key understanding of mathematics and physics to understand how to transport the gigantic stones, and how to move these stones into a standing position while remaining structurally stable. Take a moment to look at Stonehenge and figure out how you would have placed all those stones in position without the use of cranes or carts strong enough to hold the weight of the stones themselves. Over time, we begin to see more and more settlement on the Salisbury Plain, with more intricate earthworks such as the large rectangular ditches called cursus, like the Greater Stonehenge cursus, expanding settlements such as the expansion of Downton, and one other aspect which is key evidence for a group of people settling to a permanent society. Burying the dead. Between 4000 and 2200 BC, Salisbury Plain begins to be littered with purposely built graves. Earliest examples feature crude burial deposits where often only a handful of bones remain, such as the multiple finds at Durrington Walls, which is a late Neolithic settlement believed to be the home of the Stonehenge builders. Over at Durrington Walls, we find an array of both human and animal bones seemingly scattered around the outskirts of the settlement, which would have most likely been thrown into the ditches that surround the homes of these people, perhaps in the hopes that the spirits of the dead may continue to protect the living family members, or maybe they just wanted to keep their deceased relatives close, so that they may continue to pay their respects. Either way, we see a steady increase in caring for the dead around this time, with the notable rise of barrows between the late Neolithic period and the beginning of the Bronze Age. There are primarily two types of barrows that feature on the Salisbury Plain. The early example, which is the long barrow. A popular example of this would be Fusel's Lodge, which contained burials of up to 34 individuals in a wooden chamber underneath an elongated wedge-shaped mound of chalk. The other most notable option was the construction of a round barrow, which, as their name suggests, was a circular mound either of earth or chalk, with the individual buried at the centre. This tradition of building earthen mounds over the buried dead would continue for over 4,000 years. One of the most miraculous finds was that of the Amesbury Archer. Buried between 2400 and 2200 BC, this individual completely changed the way we thought about the lives of Neolithic people in Britain and indeed Europe as a whole. The Amesbury Archer was buried with an exhaustive list of belongings, including beaker pots, boar's tusks, many flint tools, 3 copper knives, a pair of gold hair ornaments, and much more. The gold and copper objects alone were proved to be the oldest found in Britain so far, pushing our understanding of the metalworking technology even further back. Indeed, along with the rest of the tools he was buried with, we believe him to be a metalworker himself, and may have travelled far and wide to show off his skills, since we believe him to have grown up in the Alps based on isotope analysis. Due to the various high-level finds buried with him in his grave, and the similar graves of others in Europe during this time period, we understand this man to be of great importance within his culture, and most likely a very wealthy man in his life. While the Amesbury Archer certainly takes the limelight, and rightfully so, it is worth pointing out that there have been many other miraculous finds from excavations around Salisbury Plain and Amesbury, such as the Boscombe Bowman only 400 metres north of the Amesbury Archer, where the remains of 8 individuals were found, ranging from children to adults, all of which were male, and had a beaker each as well as multiple barbed arrowheads and various tools. Over time, many more barrows were excavated, most commonly being accidentally found while digging the earth for modern construction projects. These finds proved that important people were being buried on Salisbury Plain near Stonehenge all throughout the Bronze Age up until about 1000 BC, and possibly even later. Speaking of the Bronze Age, here we see the population of Salisbury Plain boom, with the sheer amount of Bronze Age finds cropping up all over the landscape. Axes, arrowheads, spearheads, daggers, knives, and even swords, we find hordes upon hordes of objects, along with a network of newer earthworks and ditches scarring the landscape, which most likely served as defensive settlements or irrigation ditches for farmlands, now that farming had become even more reliable, with the invention of bronze sickles and axes which proved very useful for cutting trees and harvesting crops much more efficiently than their stone counterparts. Although we find such extraordinary objects dating back to the Bronze Age, it is believed that life for people around this time was rather similar to their ancestors in the Neolithic period, but with a steadily improving standard of living along with the growth of local communities. It's not until the Iron Age that we begin to witness some noticeable changes in the scenery. If anything can be attributed to the birth of Salisbury, it is surely the giant hill fort of Old Sarum. As had been proved before with Stonehenge, multiple people coming together to form a community are capable of achieving incredible feats of engineering and construction. No more is this true than the construction of Old Sarum Hill Fort. Although the name Old Sarum comes much later in the 13th century AD, we know that this hill fort would have been known by everyone for miles around, as its sheer size would dominate the landscape and would have been viewed as a very imposing figure. Old Sarum started its life as just one of multiple small settlements which were situated on the various hills of Salisbury Plain, with a settlement on this particular hill dating back to possibly 3000 BC or earlier. By 1500 BC, there is a significant decline in the kinds of finds that would suggest people were living on this site. However, multiple burial mounds of local chieftains pepper the hillside, which gives us a clue as to how important this hill in particular was for the people who lived in the local area. We don't know exactly why this hill fort was built, or why it was built to such a grand scale, but we do see multiple fortified settlements crop up around this time period in the Iron Age, with other serious local contenders being Danebury, Fixbury and Casterly to the north. Either built in order to deter potential attackers, or perhaps in response to previous conflicts, hundreds of defendable hill forts spring up around the Salisbury Plain over the centuries that follow, but Old Sarum continues to stand head and shoulders above the rest. As Old Sarum evolves, the ditches get larger and the walls get steeper, with the introduction of chalk to line the walls into mini cliffs, as well as the construction of wooden palisade walls, complete with a wooden gatehouse for added protection, all built by around 400 BC. The hill fort appears to have adopted the name Dun Sorvio by this time, and would be the earliest name attributed to this site that we know of. Old Sarum, or Dun Sorvio, was known to be the home of the Belgic and the Atrebates, who were Celtic British clans living in the area of modern Hampshire and Berkshire. These clans may have been separate, or indeed one single clan named the Belgic, but with the ruling house being named the Atrebates. Many of the people in these clans were known as exiles from Gaul as the Roman powerhouse began to creep north, with most of the exiled Gauls being chased away by the Romans due to attempting to raise arms against them. This meant that the Atrebates had many military men within their society, and as such they would become quite an imposing military force, made only stronger with their highly defendable base of Dun Sorvio. Regardless, the arrival of the Romans in Britain in 43 AD, led by Emperor Claudius, saw the near-instant aggression at Old Sarum, with the Roman armies laying siege and successfully taking over the hill fort just within a few years of the invasion. Interestingly, the Romans did not leave this hill fort to be abandoned after the siege, to be used as little more than a safety pen for livestock like many other of the Iron Age hill forts during the Roman period. Instead, the Romans built a military fort within the earthworks, and constructed an important road at the foot of the ramparts, which over time led to multiple Roman houses being built along the roadside, hugging the earthworks of the existing hill fort. This led to the Romans renaming the hill fort, or the general populated settlement which grew around it, Sorviodunum, and continued to be in use for at least a few hundred years. Over the decades that followed, the military base wasn't required anymore, so the soldiers moved out and the area was reused as a temple precinct. Not much is known about Sorviodunum during the Romano-British period, other than that we believe the area was divided up by rather wealthy landowners, as is evident from the multiple Roman villas sprouting up across the landscape of Salisbury Plain. The area also had an important pottery industry around the modern-day fording bridge. Evidence of this local pottery has been found all across southern Britain, telling us that there was a big market for it. Into the late 4th and 5th century AD, more metalwork is found in the area. This copper alloy bowl has been dated to around 450 AD, and would have served as a high-end piece of kitchenware. The Salisbury Museum, where this artefact resides, notes that this may have been used for religious ceremonies, and I'll be explaining exactly what that means in another video. By the time the Saxons arrived on the shores of England, Sorviodunum was a largely domesticated town, not fit to fight back. As such, some accounts describe a separate nearby Romano-British settlement of Searobyrg, which stood where modern-day Salisbury stands today, was attacked in 552 AD, and the local population who fought back were defeated and slaughtered. However, from what we understand, it is unclear whether Sorviodunum and Searobyrg were two separate settlements or indeed the same place, the name Searobyrg being of Saxon origin and Sorviodunum being unmistakably Roman. Regardless, the Saxons came to Sorviodunum and settled, integrating with the local population. This would have been the way of things for the centuries that followed. There is a notable rise in grave goods from the Saxon period that contain items of warfare, most commonly axe heads, shield bosses, swords, knives, saxes, and spearheads. This could lead us to believe that the Saxon period was clearly a more violent time to live in, but then you must also take into consideration that these grave finds belong to the important people who were evidently warriors, or possibly chieftains during their time. So it is no doubt that they would be buried with the weapons that they used throughout their lives to represent the type of person they were in their lifetime. The fact that these graves were later than the early Bronze Age or Iron Age graves means that the artefacts are more likely to survive. It is during this time that we also see the nearby settlement of Wilton beginning to develop, becoming the new, more important Saxon hub. As such, Old Sarum, or Searobyrg, was partially abandoned as people began to favour the flat ground of Wilton next to the riverside. This was not the end for Old Sarum, as a new terror was spreading fear across England: the Vikings. Raids began in the north, one of the most notable ones being that of Lindisfarne in 793 AD, but in the decades that followed, the entire span of the English coast was falling victim to sporadic Viking raids along its shores. As the devastation grew, King Alfred, who was the King of Wessex from 871 to 899 AD, had the local Saxon population move back to the safety of Old Sarum, ordering the refortification of this ancient town with new palisade walls, gatehouses and towers to further enhance the settlement's earth defences. The Saxon people lived in Old Sarum for the next century, but alas, this century bore witness to the steady increase of Viking longships anchoring along the coastlines of England, and by 1000 AD the Nordic influence had spread and much of the British Isles had come under the rule of the Danelaw. In 1003 the Dano-Norwegian king Sweyn Forkbeard arrived in Wessex and burnt both Old Sarum and Wilton to the ground. For anyone who is well read on Saxon England during the 11th century, they'll know that this century was a tumultuous and apocalyptic time indeed for the Anglo-Saxons, as in 1066 the Normans had also anchored their boats along the south coast of England near Pevensey. After the Battle of Hastings, to which I have a video explaining exactly what happened, of course I recommend you check it out, the Normans quickly began dividing up the conquered Saxon lands between the Norman lords and barons, with Old Sarum falling into the hands of Philippe de Buckland, the new High Sheriff of Wiltshire, who arrived to find a partially reconstructed Saxon settlement still struggling from the devastating Viking raid at the beginning of the century. The sheriff began work on building a Motte Bailey castle at Old Sarum, which was completed in 1070. The castle acted as a royal residence and over time was greatly expanded to create a heavily fortified circular town, complete with imposing stone gatehouses, 2 concentric rings of walls, an inner earth ditch, multiple towers and a great stone keep. Here it's important to note that despite me using the name Old Sarum, this name only actually appeared after the 13th century, and it seems that this settlement had multiple names from the ancient Celtic inhabitants of the Iron Age right up to the High Medieval period. It is assumed that the many names used to define this place comes from various derivations and abbreviations of its Latinized name from the Roman period, Sorviodunum. With this great reimagination of Old Sarum underway, talks were brought to the table about building a church which would be fit for such a glorious and prosperous town. As such, in around 1075 AD, the authorization for a cathedral was granted, and so began the construction of Old Salisbury Cathedral. Upon its completion on the 5th of April 1092, the cathedral church suffered damage from a fearsome storm just within 5 days after its consecration, which spread doubts and fears about the site's capability of housing such a tall and important building. A rocky start for Old Sarum's recently elevated status indeed, but things were destined to get worse for this ancient settlement. Bishop Roger, a close ally of Henry I, was given the keys to Old Sarum and began refurbishing the cathedral, also beginning work on a royal palace within the castle Bailey in 1110 AD. The responsibility of Old Sarum and its cathedral passed down to the brothers Herbert and Richard Poré, who were members of the clergy and very much involved in local politics. It was these brothers who instrumented the relocation of Old Salisbury, or Old Sarum, Cathedral. an important text from the period from the French cleric Peter of Blois saying, "Let us descend into the plain. There are rich fields and fertile valleys abounding in the fruits of the earth and watered by the living stream." It was on Richard Poret's own estate, named Merrifield, where the new cathedral was planned for construction. It had always been a bit of a mystery why such a large cathedral church had been built in an inconvenient place such as Old Sarum, with its high elevation, access via stone gatehouses which acted as choke points for the construction workers hauling their materials, and of course, no immediate access to a river. So the new location on Salisbury Plain, directly next to the confluence of the rivers Nadder and the Hampshire Avon, would be a perfect site for a new and improved cathedral. Although this reasoning is based on geographical logic, there are legends of this site being chosen due to someone shooting an arrow into the air from Old Sarum, miraculously striking a white deer, with the wounded deer making its way to the river confluence before falling and passing away, and hence the cathedral was built upon this site. Along with the new cathedral plans, an entire new settlement was set out on a grid. This would be known as New Sarum or New Salisbury. The church began construction in 1221 and was largely completed in just 38 years, an incredibly short amount of time for such a monolithic project, considering that most cathedrals took over 100 years to complete. To help fund the new cathedral, the architects working on the site were given royal approval to quarry Old Sarum's cathedral church, bringing the stone downhill into Salisbury Plain to be reused. By 1320, over 70,000 tonnes of stone, 3,000 tonnes of timber and 450 tonnes of lead were used in the construction of Salisbury Cathedral, complete with its famous 123-metre tall spire, making this the tallest cathedral in England. As cathedral spire building was a relatively new concept, the medieval architects had to work around the reality that the stone spires were incredibly heavy, with Salisbury's spire weighing in at over 6,500 tonnes, and as such was effectively sinking the church into the ground, leading it to regularly flood due to being so close to the water table. Of course, the sheer weight of the cathedral church in itself was causing the structure to sink and flood anyway, but the grand design of the spire only added to this problem. Multiple cathedral spires across England fell victim to storms or insufficient foundations, with such cathedrals like Lincoln, Old St Paul's of London, Chichester and Malmesbury Abbey all having their spires fall down within a few centuries of their construction. To help prevent the same fate for Salisbury Cathedral, the nave was reinforced with additional buttresses and bracing arches to anchor the church in place. As the town of New Salisbury continues to grow and gain popularity, new developments were built, including the construction of 5 cathedral-close gatehouses, along with the expansion of further monastic buildings hugging the cathedral grounds. By the 1300s, Salisbury had solidified its place as one of the most important and influential medieval cities in all of England, and would prove to be a vital part of England's history and culture for centuries to come. Now, I could talk for hours about the entire history of Salisbury from its medieval roots to present day, but this video is dedicated to the origins of Salisbury and the human settlements that came before it, laying the foundations for this incredibly important historic site. Perhaps in the future I will return to Salisbury and discuss more of its history in depth as a thriving medieval town and influential religious centre, but for now, thanks for watching.